Crime and punishment. The United States has the highest rate of imprisonment in the world. But can ex-convicts get a second chance? How effective is the American prison system? And does it need to be reformed? Hello, I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Overcrowded jails, prison gangs, and social isolation. The American criminal justice system can be harsh. Even if someone is convicted of a non-violent offense, chances are they could serve a jail sentence. And for many, a single infraction can turn into a lifelong downward spiral of crime and incarceration.
The United States has only 5% of the world's population, yet it has 25% of the world's prison population. That's over 2 million people. With 716 per 100,000 people locked up, the U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration of any country on earth. Let's compare those rates with two of the world's most populous nations. China has 122 people per 100,000 locked up, and India has 30. So what's happening in the United States? More than 4 decades ago, President Richard Nixon launched his war on crime to combat gun violence and drugs, leading to stricter legislation. In the 1980s, the U.S. Congress passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Judges were required to give fixed prison terms to those convicted of specific offenses, in the hope that harsh prison terms would deter criminals. In the 1990s, many U.S. states passed the so-called three strikes laws, a name inspired by American baseball, a game in which a pitcher eliminates a batter after 3 strikes. The laws mandated increased sentences for repeat offenders, usually after 3 serious felonies. Supporters say rigid enforcement made the streets safe and brought crime rates down. But critics argue such laws forced even non-violent offenders to serve lengthy sentences, leading to increased prison populations and ballooning costs. Compounding the issue, the private for-profit prison industry. It spent $45 million last year lobbying the U.S. Congress for tougher laws that would send more people to jail.
So what can be done to change the U.S. correctional system? Joining me now from Chicago is John Mackey. He's the executive director of the John Howard Association of Illinois. It's the oldest prison reform organization in the state. We want to welcome you to The Heat. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me get right at the heart of things. When you hear this number, it's staggering. 2.3 million, more than 2.3 million. And when you frame that, that's almost the population of Houston, Texas, or Havana, Cuba. It's immense. Why?
Well, I think to start with, it's really important to understand that the United States didn't always have such a high prison population. And in fact, for most of the 20th century, the United States incarcerated less than 250,000 people. And how we got from 250,000 to more than 2.3 million today is really, there are a lot of theories about why that happened, but I think it's the best way to understand it. It's the unintended consequences of bad policy and bad politics.
Well, that's interesting because in the past 2 decades, the imprisonment rate per capita surged by 45%. So walk us through this. What do you think, you're saying bad policy, bad politics, but specifically, and I know you've been there in the trenches, what do you point to?
So I think, to start with, it's important to see that, again, beginning really in the 1970s, we had, again, a population in the United States of about 250,000 people in prison. And in fact, there was a lot of debate that we didn't really need prisons, that prisons weren't really serving a purpose. And so states were finding ways to actually lose prisons. About that same time, the baby boomers came of age, a huge generation of young people. And what we know, what research says, is that people tend to commit crimes between the ages, often men, young men, between the ages of, the late teens to the early 30s. So this whole generation was coming of age at a time when there was a debate, when there was movement to actually do away with prisons, or at least to change them. That created an opportunity politically to exploit that. We saw crime rise, and it became a political win to advocate, to argue, to pass laws that lengthened sentences, that made more use of prisons. And then, again, at the same time, we saw the deinstitutionalization of mental health. Before the 1970s in the United States, we had many more mental health hospitals. And we started doing away with those. And so we found more mentally ill people on the streets as opposed to in hospitals. And without the hospitals, we found them in jails and prisons. And it's really, again, a confluence of those factors, which I think led to and leads to the situation we are in today, with more people imprisoned in the United States than any other country in the world.
What about the revolving door aspect? Because we see so many people leave prison and then return.
You know, and that's really the most, I think, tragic part of prison. If prison was an effective response, it would be kind of a one and done thing. You would go to prison and you wouldn't come back. But I think prison's part of our culture, and in many parts of the United States, in many neighborhoods, it's almost a rite of passage. You know, one thing that happens when you go to prison is you have a criminal record that will follow you for the rest of your life. It'll prevent job opportunities, housing opportunities, loan opportunities, and it brands you essentially as a criminal, as a convict. And so because of that, you see people lose hope, and you see that revolving door. And that's literally what it is. I mean, let me give you a concrete example. In my state of Illinois, we have about 50,000 people in our adult prison system. Every year we release about 35,000 people. And so this revolving door isn't just simply it's not just a figure of speech. It's almost literally true. You're seeing people come in, come out, come in and come out. Most people are serving very short sentences, and it becomes a way of life.
Talk to me about reintegrating these ex-convicts into society. What are some steps that could be taken that aren't being taken that could actually lead to that?
Well, I think, you know, one of the most important things of any form of punishment is that it should enable someone to come back. It should enable someone to reintegrate. In the United States, all across our country, we brand people. If people have a criminal record, that will follow them on job applications, on housing loans, small business loans, school applications, and it makes it very difficult to become a free, productive citizen again. That's a big part of why we have such a huge system, a huge dysfunctional system. So I think laws that would take aim at that would enable someone to come back from prison, to lose the stigma of a conviction, that would do a lot.
What about politicians? They play to the audience, if you will, voters, with this kind of I'm going to get tough on crime, and we've seen this with the three strikes laws. And on paper it looks like a great idea, but in execution it's been tragic for a lot of people, hasn't it?
You know, absolutely, and I think the three strikes laws, I mean, that kind of trend is really symptomatic of how we do justice in the United States. We tend to equate prison with punishment, or punishment with prison, and that's just not, that's silly, that's dumb. Prison is only one form of punishment. In terms of effectiveness, it's one of the worst things we can do. In terms of cost, it's extremely expensive, and I think with three strikes, we just think if prison equals punishment, more punishment is good for someone who's done bad things, therefore more prison. And all we've done is bloated our prison system and created a situation where people aren't able to come back to society. Let
me ask you about the war on drugs, because one of the first murder trials I ever covered was small town. It occupied everyone's attention. This guy had a great defense attorney representing him. He created reasonable doubt. And so the jury goes out to deliberate, and during that period of time, they have to get all these cases off the docket. They bring a bunch of young kids in on small charges of possession of marijuana. They all got sent off to prison 4 or 5 years. It was ridiculous. And then the jury comes back and says, well, the guy who has a great attorney, he gets off. We see a lot of this, too. Isn't there a disparity? And this war on drugs, a lot of people are going to jail for possession of quantities of marijuana that sometimes are very small.
Absolutely, and we know that these laws are enforced disproportionately. We know, for example, if you're a white youth in an affluent area, you're less likely to be charged and convicted with a crime than, say, if you're a poor youth of color in one of our cities in the United States. You know, I think what's really unusual about the case you covered is that it actually went to trial. Most criminal cases don't go to trial. They're the result of plea deals that have worked out very early in the process. And so I think, you know, what this points to is a system that there's very little discretion. You know, judges really aren't involved in making decisions about sentencing, about making decisions based on mitigating factors, a person's background. And because of that, again, that goes back to the revolving door. People are sent to prison almost on a streamline.
I want to talk to you about these private for-profit prisons as well. In a neighboring state of yours, Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court there in October of 2009 threw out 4,000 convictions of juveniles. And there was a judge who was charged with, and you may have already heard about this case, it was a Cash for Kids scheme. private prison where he was funneling these kids, a lot of times minor convictions, minor offenses. But these prisons are like hotels. I mean, the occupancy rate's got to stay high. Doesn't that create a bad environment as well?
It's a perverse incentive. Justice should not be involved with profit. I think even the appearance, the semblance of a profit motive, contaminates the justice system. And no doubt, all across the country, we have privatized prisons. Even prisons that aren't privatized, like the ones in my state, we've privatized functions inside the prison. And again, I think it creates horrible incentives, and it makes it much more difficult to tackle the problem in prison reform, which is really about creating a criminal justice system that effectively deals with crime.
You want to change things, and yet there's an organization, the Corrections Corporation of America. They spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 million each year lobbying for more expansive crime laws for this very reason. How difficult is it for you to make any kind of headway when you're up against that kind of opposition?
It's extremely difficult. I don't think it's simply the lobbying powers of corporations that profit from prisons. I think, again, in the United States, we equate punishment with prison. And when we're afraid, when we feel afraid of crime, when we fear for our safety, we want laws that feel like that make us feel safe. Not make us safe, but feel safe. And that's where prison comes in. Prison is held out as a panacea to being afraid. And it's an emotional reaction, but it's one that is very, very strong and overcomes even reasonable argument. If it was just simply a matter of presenting a case to say, look, here's our prison system, here's how much it costs us, here's how it works, I think it'd be easy to arrive at a consensus that we need something different. But as long as we have an emotional response to crime, or as long as emotions drive our response to crime, and as long as that's going to be supported by lobbying powers, it's very, very hard to change.
John Mackey, thanks so much for joining us. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
How bad are human rights violations in American prisons, and why are U.S. jails clogged with a disproportionately high number of African American and Hispanic convicts? We'll try to find some answers when we come right back. Welcome back. We examined ways to reform the American prison system. We now want to take a closer look at the inner workings of U.S. federal and state penitentiaries. How do they operate? How widespread are human rights violations in these facilities? And is the American criminal justice system stacked against African Americans and Hispanics? Joining me now from New York is Jamie Fellner. She's a senior advisor to the U.S. program of Human Rights Watch. She specializes in criminal justice issues, including prison conditions. Joining me here in the studio is Pat Nolan. He was a state lawmaker in California for 15 years. He also spent nearly 2.5 years in a federal prison on corruption charges. He's now president of Justice Fellowship, an organization dedicated to changing the U.S. criminal justice system. And I want to welcome both of you to the show. Jamie, why don't I begin with you? Let's talk about what it's like for these convicts in the penitentiary. We've heard some horror stories. You deal with human rights abuses. Give us a snapshot. How bad is it?
Well, I think the public may still have in mind a notion of prisons as being places of extreme and unrelenting violence, including violence by staff. And certainly there are some prisons that deserve that reputation. I think the more prevalent set of problems have to do with these are overcrowded, barren facilities with nothing for the men and women in them to do, with certainly unacceptably high rates of sexual abuse and other forms of violence. But the overwhelming sense is the futility, the emptiness, the lack of purpose for the incarceration of so many people. It's not a dramatic story, although there are dramatic stories to tell, but the bigger picture is one of a waste of human lives, of human potential, a waste of taxpayer money, and a lack of contribution to public safety.
Well, Pat, let me ask you, because you go at this from a different point of view, I would think. Here you are, a lawmaker, you're a policy guy, you probably had one viewpoint, suddenly here you are in the prison outfit and you're in prison. What kind of an epiphany did you have?
It was a total eye-opener. As a legislator, I'd been very interested in prisons. I'd visited 9 different prisons while I was in the legislature. But what you see on the tours with the warden leading is very different than what you see as an inmate. And what Jamie described is right. The instances of physical abuse by staff or inmates is there, but more important is the lack of hope. While I was in prison well over 1,000 times, I was told, "You ain't got nothing coming," and it's said with a sneer. And the intention is to tell you, you come from nothing, you are nothing, you will be nothing. Now, I come from a good family. I'd had a position of responsibility and authority. I had a good education. So as much as that hurt, I was able to withstand it. Think of a kid who came from an abusive household, that ran away when he was 14, that got involved in the drug culture, and has never had anybody in their life tell them they love them and that they're worthwhile. They begin to believe that they ain't got nothing coming, that the future is hopeless. And then, as Jamie said, the hours of idleness. I said, the twin curses of idleness and boredom, that's prison life. And I would much rather be busy doing something than just this enforced idleness. And yet the prisons are so crowded, there's no room for programming. In California, the famous lawsuit that the Supreme Court decided, one of the prison facilities had 85 prisoners and 1 toilet for them to share.
Well, let me ask you, I want to ask both of you about this. I've been to a lot of prisons in the West Coast and Midwest, and it's almost like the cast there in the prison were sent over from central casting, because you can go to any prison in the United States and you see a lot of the same types of people. And according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. And we do see this where it's people of color in these prisons, and you mentioned it. They may be coming from hard luck neighborhoods, and they end up in this cycle. How do we stop it? I mean, and is that the case?
Mike?
Yes.
Mike, I think it's important when you're looking at the prison population as a whole, and I still think the American public believes most people in prison are bad guys, are violent guys. What's truly distressing in the American sort of phenomena of mass incarceration is that 1 in 3 people going into prison and about 20% of people in prison have done nothing less than nonviolent drug crimes. And one of the things that I think Pat and I both would hope would come from the current fiscal crisis, and which we are starting to see in certain states at least, is that legislators and policymakers start asking themselves, what is the purpose of prison? Who do we want to have to spend time in prison? And are there other ways of holding people accountable than sending, for, again, low-level drug offenders
Jamie,
to prison?
to interrupt you, the answer is there are other options, and yet this system is pretty loused up. And one would say, the appearances, if you're looking from the outside, you don't live here in the United States, is it looks like a racist system.
But, it
is racist, and this, Mike, let me say, it is, I think it's important to sort of sort out, again, what sends people to prison. I think there's no question that drug law enforcement is just racially discriminatory. The police go into low-income black neighborhoods to make the arrests, and not surprisingly, low-income black and Hispanic people end up in prison at far higher rates than whites, even though they have comparable rates of drug offending. When you look at other kinds of crimes, you still see racial disparities, and there the racial disparities aren't caused necessarily by racially disparate law enforcement, but because people who are low income have far fewer opportunities to make it in this world, and unfortunately with the current economic situation, the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, and the middle class are being squeezed down. And over time, this is going to have reflections in deepening the color divide in U.S. prisons.
Well, let me give Pat a chance to jump in here.
Well, first of all, a rubric we use is prisons are for people we're afraid of, but we're filling them with folks we're just mad at. A lot of these low-level crimes, we're angry. They aren't following the rules of society, but they're not a danger to us. You don't go to sleep at night worried about them. And there are other ways to punish them that hold them accountable, that frankly do a better job, that don't put them in with hardened criminals, which tends to, my mom used to say, vegetables take on the flavor of the stew pot. They're going to get worse by being in with violent criminals. Hold them accountable in the neighborhood, and there are programs that work at that, and save money. But also the impact of the laws are racially disparate. You don't have to come to the conclusion that they were passed for racial reasons, but you do have to face the reality that they are having a tremendous impact. There are whole swaths of our cities in which the adult males can't participate in civic engagement. They can't even vote because of convictions. And the likelihood is their children will be incarcerated too. How do we break that cycle? And part of it is prison fellowship goes into prisons and works with the inmates and says, you do have value. Whatever you did, Jesus paid the price for your sin. It's forgiven. We're here because we love you and we want you to do better, and we'll work with you to do that. And the fascinating thing is as states begin to have a lack of money, they're turning to volunteers. We're providing these people that'll mentor, that'll help, and what inmates need more than programs is love, somebody to care about them.
Let me ask you this too, and then I'll get Jamie to jump in afterwards. But Sheriff Greg Hamilton of Travis County, in Austin, Texas, says, "It seems to me that we have criminalized being mentally ill." This is another major issue, isn't it? Talk to me about what you saw on the inside and what can be done to address it.
Well, even in the legislature, we in the 70s and beginning of the 80s.
I thought you were talking about legislators and mental illness. Sorry, Pat, I misunderstood where you were going.
The legislature had emptied our state mental hospitals, and by the time I get elected, we could see those same patients appearing on our streets, only they were called homeless. And there were no programs to put them in, so by default, the sheriff or police officer did what they called mercy bookings. They hadn't committed a crime. They got them off the streets, but they were put in jail. I got $1 million to LA County Jail to set up a forensic mental health facility to try to help them. But every police chief and sheriff will tell you, these are not bad people, they're sick. And we need acute care beds that they can be put into. And we need to focus on that. One of the problems is mental health dollars often go for people with minor life crises. Their boyfriend left them, they lost their job, they've lost a loved one. Those are all reasons to make us sad, but they don't make them dangerous. Those programs to help them are sucking up money that could to pay for the acutely mental ill, with acute beds to help them.
Jamie, we're just about out of time, but I do want to give you a chance to respond.
No, I've written extensively about the role of mental illness in U.S. prisons, and part of the problem is, as Pat was suggesting, is there is no vibrant, robust community mental health system that can take people who need help, who need emergency help or who need long-term help. They end up in the prison system, which at least provides a modicum, however poor, of mental health care. Somewhere between 20 and 50% of U.S. prison population has a serious mental illness. It's extraordinary, and it reflects the willingness of the U.S. people to put money into prisons that they aren't willing to put into strengthening communities and providing the social support services, be they mental health, medical, educational, vocational, that is needed.
Jamie, thank you for joining us from New York. Pat, thanks so much for stopping by our studios here and joining us here on The Heat. Texas has the highest prison population in the United States. Even nonviolent offenders are dealt with harshly by its legal system. But the tide is turning. In a state once known for its fearsome reputation for punishment, it's now focusing on treatment and rehabilitation. And one man has become the poster child of that movement. Ginger Vaughn explains.
So what do you figure you owe me at this point? 3?
An unconventional courtroom for an unconventional judge. Dallas District Drug Court Judge Robert Francis doesn't wear a robe and has just 2 rules. Don't run from the court and never lie.
Don't run and don't lie. If they lie to me, I will put them in jail, and they know that. So if you relapse, you're a lot better off coming in and telling your officer, telling me, Judge, I've used, and here's what happened. Been to prison before? Yes. How many times? Once?
Since 2000, Judge Francis has been dealing strictly with convicted drug offenders, undergoing a rehabilitation program known as a Substance Abuse Felony Punishment Facility, or SAFE-P for short, operated by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. It's like a classroom within prison, where for 6 to 9 months, inmates learn or relearn the rules to re-enter society. His 4C re-entry court is for those recovering addicts who've left prison. 4C stands for community, correction, and continuum of care. Once out, they must test and remain drug-free while working or going to school, or else they must answer to the judge or go back to prison. Participants like 26-year-old Joe Chapa say they fear disappointing him just as much as they do being locked up.
He just gives it to you straightforward, and like he could see through if you telling lies or whatnot. He done heard it all, you know what I mean? So the best thing to do is just be real with him, be honest with him, and it does help you. Like, it really does help you.
Drug rehabilitation programs like SafeP are about giving former addicts a chance at a new life, an opportunity to move from behind bars back into society.
Their morals and their values are different. And I'm not saying it's an excuse for their behavior that gets them in trouble, but if you don't understand that they're looking at the world different, you're not going to be able to work with them. When I was a young prosecutor, like most everybody else, I thought, well, just punish them and punish them harder and they'll change. Doesn't work.
Francis, a 53-year-old Republican who is known around the city as Judge Bobby, is a familiar face at Dallas prisons and courtrooms where he speaks with convicts bluntly about their options.
Philosophy's always been the more people you lock up, crime goes down. Well, that hadn't worked. We've reduced the number of people we've locked up and reduced the crime rate at a lower cost, which means we're saving the taxpayers money, we're making the world they live in safer by reducing the number of people we lock up and by intelligently approaching how we're going to deal with these folks.
Francis is the only Texas state judge that is committed to rehab programs in court full-time. So far, he says, this has saved taxpayers over $2 billion over the last 2 years, with fewer prisoners behind bars and fewer prisons. Texas has steadily lowered its incarceration rate by 10% in the last 15 years, recently closing 2 prisons and held off the construction of 2 others completely. The judge says the recidivism rate, the percentage of those who recommit crimes within 3 years after they're released, has dropped from 67% in 1994 to 24% today. While he says it's not perfect, it's a sign of hope for many.
Good deal. Give her a hand.
Ginger Vaughn, CCTV, Dallas, Texas.
Multiple ear piercings.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you. So please email us your questions, comments, and suggestions to theheat@cctv-america.com. Once again, that's theheat@cctv-america.com. And if you missed any of today's show or you want to catch any of our programming online, you can always log on to cctv-america.com. Once again, that's cctv-america.com. And remember, when the weekend rolls around again, don't forget to turn on the heat. Until then, I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time. It's staggering, 2.3 million, more than 2.3 million. And when you frame that, that's almost the population of Houston, Texas, or Havana, Cuba. It's immense. Why?
Well, I think to start with, it's really important to understand that the United States didn't always have such a high prison population. And in fact, for most of the 20th century, the United States incarcerated less than 250,000 people. And how we got from 250,000 to more than 2.3 million today is really, there are a lot of theories about why that happened, but I think it's the best way to understand it. It's the unintended consequences of bad policy and bad politics.
Well, that's interesting because in the past 2 decades, the imprisonment rate, prison gangs, and social isolation. The American criminal justice system can be harsh. Even if someone is convicted of a non-violent offense, chances are they could serve a jail sentence. And for many, a single infraction can turn into a lifelong downward spiral of crime and incarceration.
The United States has only 5% of the world's population, yet it has 25% of the world's prison population. That's over 2 million people. With 716 per 100,000 people locked up, the U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration of any country on earth. Let's compare those rates with 2 of the world's most populous nations. China has 122 people per 100,000 locked up, and India? Supporters say rigid enforcement made the streets safe and brought crime rates down. But critics argue such laws forced even non-violent offenders to serve lengthy sentences, leading to increased prison populations and ballooning costs. Compounding the issue, the private for-profit prison industry. It spent $45 million last year lobbying the U.S. Congress for tougher laws that would send more people to jail.
So what can be done to change the U.S. correctional system? Joining me now from Chicago is John Mackey. He's the executive director of the John Howard Association of Illinois. It's the oldest prison reform organization in the state. We want to welcome you to the heat. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me get right at the heart of things. When you hear this number,
That's 30. So what's happening in the United States? More than 4 decades ago, President Richard Nixon launched his war on crime to combat gun violence and drugs, leading to stricter legislation. In the 1980s, the U.S. Congress passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Judges were required to give fixed prison terms to those convicted of specific offenses, in the hope that harsh prison terms would deter criminals. In the 1990s, many U.S. states passed the so-called three strikes laws, a name inspired by American baseball, a game in which a pitcher eliminates a batter after 3 strikes. The laws mandated increased sentences for repeat offenders, usually after 3 serious felonies.
crime and punishment. The United States has the highest rate of imprisonment in the world. But can ex-convicts get a second chance? How effective is the American prison system? And does it need to be reformed? Hello, I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Overcrowded jails,